I only needed shelter. But something beneath that stove had been waiting for me.
She was 21 and homeless. No coat thick enough. No room key. No promised paycheck. Just a canvas tool roll and $5 she had saved from her grandfather's funeral coat. And with that $5, she bought a cast-iron stove foundry abandoned outside Troy in Rensselaer County, New York, after it vanished from county maps in 1978. Half the north roof had folded inward. The cupola chimney leaned 6 inches toward the road. The county condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. But beneath the ash drawer of one flowered parlor stove waited a double mica floor, unopened for decades, holding money, a silver draft knob, and a secret meant for someone cold. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Voss had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in the narrow part of Cohoes where brick mills blocked the late sun and winter wind came off the Mohawk, smelling of wet stone. Her father left before she could remember his hands. Her mother, Elaine, folded hospital laundry and taught Clara to stretch soup 3 days, turn cuffs before they frayed, and never owe more than she could repay. What Elaine could not teach was how to stay tender when fear entered a room. Bills made her quiet. Bad news made her practical. When Clara cried, her mother set down a glass of water, as if grief were another fever that might pass by morning. On Saturdays, Clara belonged to her grandfather Elias Voss. He had spent 42 years moulding stoveplates in sand, first in Troy and later behind his house. His left thumb was flattened by an old Fluss clamp, and iron dust lived in the creases beside his nails. At 7 each morning he warmed 2 biscuits on a box stove, tied a leather apron around Clara twice, and let her sift facing sand through a brass screen. Together they rammed small moulds around wooden patterns, lifted the cope straight so the edges would not tear, and brushed grains from scrollwork with a squirrel hair brush. At noon he cooled coffee in a saucer and gave her cider in the matching cup. He never hurried metal even when customers waited. A fire stays honest only when the air is exact, he told her. Clara first heard shop instruction. Years later, she understood he meant that survival depended on guarding one small flame. Elias died during a sleet storm in February 2018. By the time Clara reached his house, distant cousins had emptied the shop. The moulding tools went to auction, his pattern books vanished, and the notebooks with scorched corners were said to have been thrown out with oily rags. Clara found only the canvas tool roll beneath his bench, with black sand caught in the stitching. 4 years later she rented a 3rd-floor room from Morton Bell, manager of the Delavan house, where hallways smelled of cabbage and radiator paint. Bell wore polished brown shoes in snow and kept the rent ledger beneath glass. He never shouted. He tapped dates with one clean fingernail, spoke through the chain on tenants' doors, and switched off corridor lights at 10. Mercy in his building was treated as damage to be contained. On November 12th, Clara came home from the failed packaging company and found her room key across Bell's ledger. Her final paycheck had not cleared. The company phones were disconnected. She placed the canvas roll on his desk and asked for 4 days. Bell turned the key once with one finger. You pay tonight, or you leave before midnight. Clara called her mother from the lobby. Elaine answered on the 5th ring. Clara explained the bankruptcy, the locked payroll office, the snow beginning against the glass. Her mother breathed into the receiver. In the background, a TV audience applauded. Then the line went dead without a word. Bell set Clara's chipped blue mug outside with her bag. At 11:40 he shut the front door and slid the bolt. The mug rolled from the bag, struck the iron step and broke through the handle. Clara left it there because carrying a broken cup seemed more dangerous than leaving proof she had once expected to return. For 6 weeks she moved according to warmth. She slept 2 nights in the Albany bus terminal until security learned her face, 3 beneath a church stairwell in Watervliet, and 1 inside a laundromat bathroom in Green Island, with her boots braced against the door. She rode the last bus to keep blood moving, then walked until morning when fares became too dear. $5 became $4.12 after bread and coffee, then $2.67 after hand warmers, then $1.03 after soup in Troy. She washed in library sinks, dried socks beneath restroom blowers, and wrapped the empty tool roll around her ribs. Each night she counted what remained by touch. On December 23rd, sleet glazed the Troy Public Library windows. Clara sat near a radiator that clicked without giving much heat and searched county notices because job boards had begun to resemble locked doors. Beneath listings for culvert, pipe and office chairs, she found one plain line: condemned industrial parcel, former Voss stoveworks, $5 quitclaim, buyer assumes all risk. She read the surname twice. The clerk let her print 1 page without paying. Clara folded it into the tool roll, spent her final dollar on a bus fare east, and kept the 3 pennies in her glove. She did not believe the building would save her. She only knew it carried a name no one else had kept. At dawn, with snow whitening Troy's roofs, Clara boarded the county bus toward the last road on the notice. The county bus climbed east through sleet, its heater breathing lukewarm air against Clara's wet boots. She rode 14 miles from Troy, got off beside a shuttered farm stand in Brunswick, and walked another 9 along Hoosick Road with the tool roll under her coat. Snow deepened after dark. She slept in the hayloft of an unused red barn where mice moved beneath the boards and the temperature fell to 11 degrees. Before dawn, she woke with 1 cheek numb against her sleeve. By mid-morning she reached Eagle Mills, a bend in the road held together by 5 useful places: Gorman Hardware, the Bluebird Cafe, Ferris Feed and Seed, St. Agnes Thrift, and Hudson River Community Bank. Christmas wreaths hung in the windows. A woman carrying pie tins saw the county notice in Clara's hand and pointed uphill toward the annex. The clerk's office occupied a brick building that had once been a school. Behind the counter sat a woman with 1 white streak in her black hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. The brass plate before her said Marjorie Kell, Deputy Clerk. Clara slid the notice beneath the glass. Mrs. Kell read it, then looked over her glasses. You understand the county will not repair the roof? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no inspected well? Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure is condemned for occupancy? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition costs become yours if you fail? Yes, ma'am. The clerk studied Clara's face, then opened a drawer and removed a quitclaim packet. Clara signed with a bank pen attached to a chain. Her fingers shook badly enough that the first C resembled a broken circle. Mrs. Kell carried the deed to a side table and pressed a heavy brass stamp into a red pad. The seal landed with a dull thud. She gave Clara a carbon copy, then drew directions on an envelope: east on Hoosick, left after the white church, 1 mile past the abandoned quarry, then down a lane marked by 2 granite posts. If the plough has buried the entrance, watch for the walnut trees. They stand in a straight row. She was blotting the stamp when her eyes stopped on the surname. Voss, she said. Are you Elias Voss's granddaughter? Clara's hand closed over the counter. He came here every spring for years, Mrs. Kell said. Paid the taxes on that parcel even after the foundry closed. My father said Elias could judge a stoveplate by tapping it with his wedding ring. He tried to buy the place once, but the owners never answered. He never told me. He may have believed there was more time. Mrs. Kell opened a grey folder. The last year he came, he left a note asking us not to separate the machines from the building at auction. She removed a half-sheet scorched brown along one edge. The handwriting was Elias's, narrow and upright. Clara recognized the long tail of his Y before she understood any word. She folded it and placed it inside the canvas roll. Mrs. Kell pushed the deed through the slot. The parcel is yours as of 10:17 this morning. Outside. Dry snow had replaced the sleet. Clara followed the envelope map past the white church and the quarry, where black water showed between shelves of ice. At a green mailbox, an elderly man in a canvas cap stood beside a brindled hound. "You heading for the old stoveworks?" Clara nodded. Lanes drifted shut. "Keep left of the stone wall. Dog's Amos. Mine's Vernon." Amos followed her to the first walnut tree before Vernon called him back. The trees stood bare and evenly spaced, their branches holding small caps of snow. Clara walked between them until the road dipped and the Foundry rose from the hollow. It was nearly 90 feet long and 36 across, brick over limestone footings, with timber framing exposed beneath the folded north roof. Tar paper snapped in the wind, the cupola chimney leaned beyond the ridge. 4 windows were boarded. 3 had no glass, and a faded iron sign above the double doors still carried the words Voss, Stoveworks beneath rust. The county had cut the padlock. Clara lifted the latch and pushed. The door moved 6 inches, stopped against fallen plaster, then yielded with a scrape that travelled through the building. Cold metal had its own smell, bitter beneath damp timber. Her boots crushed old casting sand that gritted between her teeth when she breathed. Light entered through roof gaps and rested on a front room crowded with stove bodies, their doors hanging open. One was ornamented with grapevines, another had a cracked warming shelf. When Clara touched the nearest plate, frost melted beneath her palm and left a print in the soot. Beyond a brick arch lay the moulding floor. Broken wooden patterns leaned against the wall, and iron flasks sat half-buried in sand hardened by years of leaks. A pulley chain moved in the draught with a patient click. Water dripped somewhere behind the wall. Clara tasted rust in the air and found one enamel cup that still carried the faint smell of old coffee. The back room held the cupola base, a workbench, and a small flowered parlor stove fixed to a sheet metal hearth. Dry charcoal lay beneath its grate, protected by a stovepipe still seated in the chimney thimble. Clara did not light it. Elias had taught her that an unseen flue could kill more quietly than cold. She swept a space on the office floor with a broken moulding brush, laid flattened feed sacks beneath her coat, and set the deed inside her shirt. Darkness filled the front room before 5. Wind found the missing panes and made the pulley chain count the seconds. Clara ate half a heel of bread, placed the empty tool roll beneath her head, and listened to snow settle over the damaged roof. The building did not feel welcoming. It felt watchful, wounded, and exact. Still, it had walls. On the coldest night, a small flame, properly sheltered, can be enough to save a human life. At first light, Clara began with water. The Foundry well stood 30 yards behind the moulding room beneath a roof of split cedar. She lowered the bucket slowly, heard it strike ice, then broke the skin with an iron rod and drew up water clouded by leaf dust. She boiled every cup. The outhouse leaned toward the creek but remained usable after she replaced one hinge with baling wire. By the 3rd day she knew which floorboards groaned beneath the office doorway, which plank dipped beside the cupola, and where to step when carrying water in darkness. She also learned that cold entered through openings too small to see. It slid beneath brick joints, travelled through stove plates and settled inside her sleeves. Each morning she walked to Eagle Mills to warm her hands at the library annex and read about chimneys, draft and carbon monoxide before returning to work. On the 4th morning she entered Gorman Hardware. The store smelled of pine handles, kerosene and burlap seed sacks. Glass jars of screws stood behind the counter, and bells tied to the door trembled long after it closed. The owner, Samuel Gorman, had a white moustache stained yellow at one corner, and wore a carpenter's pencil behind his ear despite having no hair to hold it. He watched Clara place 3 pennies on the counter. "What can those buy?" "Not much," she said. "But I own the Voss Foundry." Samuel removed the pencil and examined her as if checking a board for warp. "Then those pennies buy honesty. What do you need first? A chimney brush, stove cement, food, if there's enough left." "There isn't." He took a ruled account book from beneath the register. "I can open you 30 days of credit. No interest. You sign every purchase. I have no wages coming. You have property in both hands." He wrote Clara Voss at the top of a page, then placed a thin, grease-marked booklet beside it. Home repairs for farm and shop had been printed in 1966. "Manuals free," he said. Previous owner underlined everything twice and followed none of it. Clara bought a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $8.75, 25 feet of jointed fiberglass rod for $6.40, a 1-pound tub of furnace cement for $2.10, a galvanized pail for $1.25, and 2 pounds of dried beans for 86 cents. Samuel added a pair of leather gloves without entering them in the book. "You forgot those." "No. I forgot the price." Back at the foundry, Clara removed the parlor stove's stovepipe 1 section at a time. The elbows were packed with soot dense as wool. She carried them outside, tapped them against a stump, and watched black flakes stain the snow. Before climbing, she tied a rope around her waist and looped it through an iron roof bracket, though the bracket itself moved when she tested it. The chimney cap had rusted through. She lowered the brush from above, turning clockwise so the threaded rods would not separate inside the flue. At first it stopped 8 feet down. She pulled, twisted, and drove it again until a hardened shelf of creosote broke loose with a sound like crockery collapsing. Black dust poured into the stove below. She worked for 5 hours, adding 1 rod at a time, scraping the liner until the brush moved from cap to thimble without resistance. The creosote came out in glossy curls and brittle scales, some thick enough to hold a fingerprint. She filled most of the galvanized pail. Then she inspected the mortar joints with a candle, sealed 2 hairline gaps using furnace cement pressed deep with a wet putty knife, and left the flue untouched overnight. The following afternoon she built a test fire no larger than her 2 hands. She placed crumpled library notices beneath dry twigs, added 3 pieces of split maple Vernon had left by the lane, and opened the draught fully. Smoke hesitated under the top plate, then lifted into the pipe. Clara held a cold spoon near each joint. No soot marked it. Outside, a pale ribbon rose from the chimney and leaned east. She fed the flame 1 stick at a time. The flowered iron panels warmed from black to a soft, living brown, and frost retreated across the floorboards in an uneven circle. In the enamel cup she simmered beans with salt. Samuel had folded into paper. She ate them sitting on an overturned mould flask, holding the cup between both palms. It was her first hot meal in 8 days. Once the office could remain above freezing, Clara turned to the workroom. She did not inventory everything. Much had been ruined beyond use. She chose what still possessed a purpose. 2 wooden stove leg patterns carved with acanthus leaves, a brass riddle for screening facing sand, 3 iron moulding flasks with straight pins, a hand ladle scaled white from heat, a box of square stove bolts, a bench vise with Voss stamped beneath its jaws, and 6 scorched notebook leaves trapped behind a drawer. The pages carried Elias's hand. Some sentences ended where fire had eaten the paper, others preserved ratios without headings, 3 measures new pig to 1 return scrap, phosphorus low for hinge plates, pour ornament while the iron still runs like lamp oil. Clara flattened each sheet beneath pieces of window glass and copied the surviving words into the margins of the repair manual. The last object she examined was the flowered stove. Its body stood 32 inches high, with nickel trim gone grey, and a cast garland circling the firebox. The rear plate bore the Foundry name and a patent date from 1896. Its ash drawer resisted when she pulled. She worked graphite from an old lock into the runners until the drawer slid free, releasing a layer of clinker fused into rough black stones. She carried it outside and chipped away the ash with a narrow cold chisel. Beneath the clinker, the drawer bottom appeared sound. Yet when she tapped it with the chisel handle, the front gave a flat iron note and the rear answered lower. Clara tapped again. The sound changed 6 inches from the back edge. She weighed the drawer in her hands, then compared it with another of similar size. The flowered drawer was nearly 4 pounds heavier. Along its underside, soot concealed 4 small screws. She cleaned their slots with a needle, soaked them in kerosene, and waited an hour before turning them. 3 released, the 4th snapped beneath the head. She did not pry. Instead, she drilled around the broken shank with a hand brace, lifted a thin iron plate, and found a second floor made from heat-resistant mica. The sheets had been cut to fit so closely that ash could not enter the seam. At the centre sat a cedar disc darkened by years of warmth, no wider than a silver dollar. 2 shallow holes had been bored into it. Clara inserted the points of a pair of dividers and turned counterclockwise. The disc moved less than an inch, stopped, then loosened with a dry breath of cedar. Beneath it lay a cloth loop. She pulled carefully. A narrow packet rose from the hollow between the iron and mica. Then another. Both were wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed linen. A flat tin box remained below them, fitted so exactly that Clara had to bend a wire hook to lift it without scratching the sides. She placed everything on the office desk and closed the stove door against the draught. The first packet contained tools small enough for ornamental work, 3 veining chisels, a silver-handled burnisher, 2 spoon-shaped slicks, and Elias's flattened brass moulding needle. Clara knew it from the Saturdays of her childhood. A dark mark remained where his thumb had rested. The second held bars of tin, copper, and antimony wrapped separately, along with a solid silver draft control knob shaped like a 6-petaled flower. Its shaft had never been installed. Beneath it lay a stitched notebook filled with furnace charges, cooling times, and sketches for a stove intended to hold heat until morning. Clara opened the tin box last. Inside were paper packets labelled by year. The first held Morgan silver dollars worn smooth at the eagle's breast. The next contained Liberty Head half eagles, each wrapped in tissue. There were Barber half dollars, Indian head cents, and several small envelopes of banknotes pressed between mica sheets. At the bottom lay a purple heart in its black case, engraved E. Voss, 1918. She counted once, wrote the total, then counted again. The money came to $33,200 exactly. Clara separated each type into rows and checked every figure against the notebook's blank back pages. She did not laugh or speak. When her hands began to tremble, she placed them flat on the desk until they stopped. The amount could have bought heat, food, a room, and months without watching doorways, yet the coins remained where she had set them, cold circles beneath the lamp. Under the medal lay an envelope addressed only to "My dear one." The handwriting was not Elias's. Clara carried the envelope to the stove but did not break the seal. Reading it that night would have felt like entering a room before knocking. She returned the money to the tin box, wrapped the tools again, and placed the notebook beside her bedroll. Outside, the clouds had opened. Moonlight lay across the quarry water and the frozen creek below the walnut trees. Clara stood without her coat until the cold reached her shoulders. Behind her, smoke rose cleanly from the repaired flue, and one narrow window glowed over the snow. On the coldest night, a small flame, properly sheltered, can be enough to save a human life. Morning entered through the roof gaps in narrow silver bars. Clara fed 2 sticks into the parlor stove, washed her hands, and carried the sealed envelope to the office desk. When she turned it over, the slant of the address caught her. She had seen that hand beneath Elias's scorched notes, in small corrections written between his lines. She warmed the wax beside the stove, eased a knife beneath the fold, and opened the letter without tearing it. "My dear one, whoever you are." If you have found this, then the flowered stove kept its promise longer than I did. My name is Ruth Adelaide Voss. In March of 1946, Dr. Miriam Feld at Samaritan Hospital in Troy told me that the growth in my left lung had spread and that I should put my affairs in order before summer. I had no child to receive this place, and no strength left to wait for the person I once expected. Our trade began with Matthias Voss, who came from Pennsylvania to Troy in 1848 and cast cook-stove doors beside the Hudson. His son Wilhelm built this foundry in 1876. Wilhelm's daughter Clara Voss took charge of pattern work in 1901, though the ledgers called her only an assistant. Her son Elias, born in 1919, learned moulding here before the army carried him to France. I am Clara's daughter and Elias's older sister. The trade closed on October 17th, 1945. For more than 30 years before that date, our family spoke less and less about what had been lost. My husband, Thomas Bellamy, was killed at Chateau Thierry in July 1918. My brother Elias came home from the Second World War carrying wounds he would not name. Silence became our poorest inheritance. The notebook contains the stove mixture my mother guarded. Charge 3 parts clean grey pig iron to 1 part sound return scrap. Keep phosphorus below 0.8% for doors and hinges. Bring the cupola metal near 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, but pour the ornament plates between 2,350 and 2,400, while the stream still folds like lamp oil. Let the heavy fireback cool in dry sand for 18 hours. Seal each joint with 1 part fire clay, 1 part fine ash, and enough salt water to make a paste that will hold a thumbprint. The silver draught knob belongs to the final pattern. A stove fitted with it held useful heat until dawn on 1 armful of maple. We never sold it. War took the men, stillness took the years, and pride kept us from asking for help. The money is not payment for finding this place. Use what is necessary to make the work safe and honest. Keep the tools in hands that understand patience. Inheritance is not the possession of finished things. It is the duty of continuing a task carefully enough that another person may continue after you. The medal belonged to Thomas. If you can, place it where his name may be spoken once more. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Adelaide Voss Bellamy, April 8th, 1946. Clara read the letter twice. The second time she followed each line with Elias's moulding needle, stopping where Ruth had named him as a young man rather than the grandfather Clara had known. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases and returned them to the envelope. The letter mentioned a marker behind the cupola, placed level with the 4th walnut tree. Clara went through the back door with a shovel and counted from the road. Snow covered the ground to her ankles. Beneath the 4th tree, the shovel struck stone after 3 careful cuts. She cleared a small granite marker no larger than a breadboard. Moss filled the carved letters. Thomas Bellamy, 1894 to 1918. Below the dates was a simple stovemaker's mark, a 6-petaled flame matching the silver knob. Someone had set the stone facing east, where morning light reached it before the foundry roof. Clara pressed the snow flat around its base. She did not move the medal yet. The ground was frozen too hard for ceremony, and the letter had asked for care rather than haste. Inside, she chose the smallest object from the first packet, a brass hand lamp with a thumb wheel and a cotton wick hardened by age. The reservoir still smelled faintly of whale oil and iron filings. She cleaned it with a strip of linen, filled it with kerosene from Samuel's store, trimmed the wick to an even 1/4 inch, and struck 1 match. The flame lifted thin and uncertain, then steadied beneath the glass. Its light fell across the names in Ruth's letter. Clara began to understand how she had reached the desk at all. Mrs. Kell had waived the printing fee and preserved Elias's note. Vernon had left split maple without asking who would repay him. Samuel had opened a ledger to a woman with 3 pennies. The laundromat attendant in Green Island had once looked at Clara's wet socks beneath the dryer and silently added 20 minutes to the machine. None of them had repaired her life. Each had sheltered one small piece of it long enough for the next morning. There may be a kindness you remember for the same reason, not because it solved everything, but because it arrived at the exact hour you could not continue alone. Tell us in the comments what someone once did for you, however small it seemed to them. Sometimes the smallest mercy is the one a person carries longest. That night Clara placed the wrapped tools, the notebook, Ruth's letter, and Thomas's medal beside her bedroll. She left the brass lamp burning low on the desk until the stove had settled into red coals, then pinched the wick dark and slept with one hand resting against the canvas tool roll. December 4th brought the first true snow, 7 inches laid across the damaged roof before dawn. Clara read the roofing chapter in Samuel's repair manual 3 times, once by the stove, once beneath the north rafters, and once outside with the book wrapped in waxed paper. The roof measured 90 feet by 36, but only the collapsed northern section required immediate work. She calculated 24 squares of asphalt shingles, 6 rolls of felt, and 60 pounds of galvanized nails, then checked every figure before entering it in Samuel's ledger. He studied the total and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. "It belonged to my brother," he said. "He would rather it worked." The following morning, Vernon arrived without Amos. He wore a wool cap pulled over both ears and carried a chalk box in one hand. He had roofed barns for 38 years before his knees stopped trusting ladders. "I cannot pay you," Clara said. "Then do not waste time trying." They worked 11 days. Clara sistered split rafters with straight hemlock, clamping each new board beside the old. Before driving carriage bolts through both, Vernon snapped blue chalk lines across the felt and taught her to set each shingle by its exposure rather than by the uneven roof edge. He drove nails with 3 strokes, one to start, one to seat, one to make the head lie flush. "That nail's proud." Clara studied the raised head. "Pull it." By the 8th day, her shoulders burned before noon, and wind lifted the felt whenever she released it. They weighted each course with stoveplates until it was nailed. On December 15th, Clara set the final ridge shingle while Vernon watched from the ladder. Snowmelt ran from the eaves instead of through the moulding floor. That evening, no bucket was needed beneath the north wall. January exposed the chimney. Once the roof stopped leaking, Clara could see that more than 20 bricks had spalled, their faces flaking under her fingers. Mortar had powdered inside the joints until sections near the roofline could be scraped out with a spoon. She tied herself to the same iron bracket, carried bricks up 4 at a time, and rebuilt only what she could remove safely before dark. Samuel ordered hydraulic lime and fireclay. Clara mixed them 2 parts lime to 1 part fireclay, adding sharp sand until the mortar clung beneath the trowel without sliding. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that stayed in the 20s. Bare hands shaped joints more accurately than gloves, but her fingers went numb every 15 minutes. She climbed down, held them near the stove until they hurt, then climbed again. The chimney taught her not to confuse speed with progress. Some days she replaced 6 bricks. On others, wind allowed only 2. She tooled each joint slightly concave so water would shed from the face, then covered the fresh work overnight with burlap. Late on January 28th, Clara built a test fire from dry maple and 1 small piece of oak. She warmed the flue gradually, checked every joint with a candle, and watched the smoke rise without spilling beneath the stove lid. Outside, the chimney drew a straight grey column into still air. Clara stood beside it until the last trace cleared the roof. The floors began with white pine. Years of casting sand had ground the office boards nearly black, but beneath the surface they remained sound. Clara pulled the worst planks, replaced them with salvaged white pine, and fastened each one using hand-cut rosehead nails she found in a drawer beneath the vise. Their irregular heads sat better beside the old boards than modern wire nails. Samuel rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit to remove soot and warped finish. crossed the room again with 120, then made a final slow pass with 220. Dust entered her hair, her cuffs, and the seams of the stove doors. Each evening she swept twice and wiped the boards with a cloth dampened in mineral spirits. 3 coats of oil followed. Clara rubbed the first deeply into the grain, let the second sit until the surface dulled, and spread the third with a folded linen pad. She allowed 48 hours for the floor to cure, moving only on narrow planks laid from the doorway to the stove. The wood changed from dark honey toward mahogany. Old nail heads appeared like small black seeds. One morning she carried the sander into the moulding room and could not switch it on. Her hands rested on the handle while the machine remained silent. Outside, a great blue heron stood at the edge of the marsh, one leg lifted above the thawing water. Clara sat on a stone beside the creek and watched it for most of the day. She did no work. The heron left before dusk, and she returned inside without apologizing to the empty rooms. February belonged to the windows. There were 8. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 held a wavering original pane dated by a scratched corner mark to 1788, salvaged from an earlier house and reused when the Foundry was built. Clara preserved that pane exactly as it was, including the bubbles that bent the walnut trees into soft lines. She removed each sash, labelled the weights, and scraped the old putty without levering against the glass. For the replacements, she bedded the panes in thin rolls of DAP 33, pressed glazing points every 8 inches, then drew the putty knife in one continuous stroke so the bevel met the sight line cleanly. The first corners were clumsy. By the 5th window the angles met without seams. The sash cords had rotted inside the pockets. Clara replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowering each iron counterweight carefully before tying a figure-8 knot through its eye. She tested every sash twice, listening for the weight to travel without striking the jamb. On the final afternoon, she raised the last window and felt it balance at shoulder height. A chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch beyond the glass, shook snow from its wings, and faced the Foundry, as though inspecting the work. Clara stood still until it flew. By late February, the walls had begun to look worse beside the repaired windows. Horsehair plaster sagged between hand-split oak lath, and 3 patches near the chimney fell before they dried. Clara swept each failure into the same pail and began again. Samuel found an old feed bag of horsehair in his loft. She washed it, cut the fibres short, and mixed them into lime plaster until each handful held together without clumping. The scratch coat went on first, pressed hard through the lath and scored with a notched stick. She followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it untouched for 72 hours. The finished coat was 1/8 inch, smooth enough to catch light, but not so smooth that it denied the wall's age. At the chimney corner, Clara ran her palm over the final patch. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it aloud. The sentence remained behind her teeth. Private and steady. Doris Hale began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She owned the Bluebird Cafe and wore red spectacles attached to a silver chain. The bags held biscuit ends, 2 boiled eggs, or stew too thick to sell as soup. Clara carried payment to the cafe 3 times. Doris pushed it back with one floury finger. In candles when the shop reopens. Caleb Mercer arrived on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul strapped across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, and missing the top button of his coat. Without introducing himself, he split a week's maple beside the lane, stacking each piece bark side up. Clara offered him $2. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather, that was all." He returned on Saturdays whenever the road was clear. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at 7:20, a tall man with one trouser cuff tucked into his boot. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat at the lane, looked once toward the chimney smoke, and offered the same 4 words. "Keep this house warm," Clara answered by lifting one hand from her work. She postponed the cellar until February 11th, after 2 days of dry weather lowered the creek. The door lay beneath the rear stairs, swollen into its frame. Once opened, it revealed 7 granite steps descending to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. At the centre stood a dressed granite slab, marked with the 6-petaled stove flame. Clara brushed dirt from its edges, but did not lift it. The stone was too deliberate to disturb without understanding why it had been placed there. Under the 3rd step, a small oak box had been wedged behind a loose stone. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been cast in the shape of a stove door, and a tintype wrapped in wool. The photograph showed a young woman outside the Foundry in the summer of 1903. She held a wooden stove leg pattern beneath one arm. Her mouth, brow, and level gaze resembled Clara's so closely that Clara lowered the image before looking again. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words Clara Voss, daughter of Wilhelm, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the silver draught knob. She tried it in the office desk, the tool chest, the front door, and every stove lock that remained intact. It opened none of them. By March, snow withdrew from the south wall in grey folds. The creak became loud enough to hear from the moulding room, and pale green catkins hung from the walnut branches. Clara opened the windows at noon and let the air move through rooms that had been closed for nearly half a century. She decided not to begin full iron founding that spring. The cupola required inspection, the sand floor needed rebuilding, and knowledge was not proved by possession. She would spend 1 coin from the cash on materials, melt only small test charges, and practice on samples no larger than her palm. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara poured the first stove plate she was willing to keep. It was not a door or a fireback. It was a 6-inch draft register patterned from Ruth's notebook, with 12 narrow openings and the 6-petaled flame at its centre. Clara charged the rebuilt cupola with 3 parts clean grey pig iron and 1 part return scrap, measured the heat with an optical pyrometer, and tapped the metal when it reached 2,375 degrees Fahrenheit. The stream entered the sand mould without breaking. She left the casting buried 18 hours. When Clara lifted it the next morning, the petals were complete, the edges sharp, and the metal answered her hammer with 1 clear note. She set Ruth's silver knob into the centre shaft. It turned without binding. The Foundry no longer resembled a ruin, though Clara had not erased its years. The white pine floors carried old burn marks beneath their oil. Repaired plaster curved around the stovepipe, patterns hung from wooden pegs above the bench, and the brass hand lamp stood beneath Ruth's framed letter. The flowered parlour stove warmed the office each evening, its mica windows glowing the colour of dark honey. The brass key remained on the mantel until a January wind brought down a limb from the 4th walnut tree. Clara cut the splintered branch and found a rectangular iron plate set into the trunk's older scar, nearly hidden beneath bark. The plate bore a keyhole and the stove door emblem. The brass key entered without resistance. Inside the hollow was a cedar-lined chamber. It held a folded 48-star American flag, dry and carefully wrapped, and a note dated October 6th, 1918. The writing belonged to Clara Voss, the woman in the tintype. She had written while influenza moved through Troy, and casualty lists from France arrived each week. Thomas Bellamy was still missing after the fighting near St. Mihiel. Clara Voss had placed the flag in the walnut tree because Ruth could not bear to see it folded in the house. If Thomas returned, the note said, they would hang it above the stoveworks door. If he did not, it should remain sheltered until someone could carry his name without turning his death into display. Clara read the note beneath the tree. Snow collected along the paper's creases. She folded it, wrapped the flag again, and carried both inside. The Purple Heart was taken to Oakwood Cemetery on November 11th, 2025, the anniversary of the armistice. Clara placed it beneath Thomas Bellamy's name during a private service attended by Doris, Samuel, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, and Mrs. Kell. There was no speech. Reverend Boyd read the dates, and Clara pressed one small stone into the winter grass. Of the $33,200, Clara used 4 coins. 1 paid for refractory brick. 1 bought certified pig iron for the first test charges. 1 covered a new leather apron made by a saddler in Hoosick Falls. The 4th paid for archival glass over Ruth's letter. The remaining money returned to the tin box. Clara added copies of the deed, her repair accounts, the Foundry notebook, and instructions for locating the mica compartment. On top, she placed a plain envelope marked for the next one. Then she sealed the box beneath a new ash drawer floor made to the old measurements. The Foundry reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the Bluebird Cafe corkboard beside notices for firewood and piano lessons. It read, Voss Stove Works, small castings, repairs, pattern copies, letters answered Tuesdays, by spring. More than 40 names filled Clara's mailing list. Most asked for hinge plates, grate bars, or missing feet for family stoves. She accepted only work she could complete carefully. Some weeks she finished 1 piece. Some weeks she completed none. Caleb returned in June, carrying a hand-carved sign beneath one arm. He had grown broad through the shoulders and now drove an old pickup instead of the Schwinn. The sign followed the original lettering, Voss Stove Works. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he had carved daughters. Clara ran her fingers across the new words. There were daughters before me, she said. I know, Caleb answered. They hung the sign above the double doors, leaving the older iron letters visible beneath it. The addition did not correct the past. It simply refused to hide it again. That autumn, Clara began a letter of her own. She wrote at Ruth's desk with Elias's brass moulding needle beside the paper and the tintype propped against the lamp. She described the roof dimensions, the chimney mixture, the well depth, and the cupola repairs. She recorded Samuel's credit ledger, Vernon's 3-stroke nail method, and Doris's promise to be paid in candles. She explained which walnut held the flag chamber and why the granite slab in the cellar had still not been lifted. Then she began the second page. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote that the money was not a prize. The Foundry was not proof that suffering had been necessary. Cold remained cold, and abandonment did not become kindness merely because someone survived it. What mattered was that careful hands had left a way through. Near midnight, Clara stopped writing and opened the draft register on the flowered stove. Air moved through the silver knob. The coals brightened without flaring, and warmth travelled slowly across the plates, exactly as Ruth's notebook had promised. On the coldest night, a small flame, properly sheltered, can be enough to save a human life. Clara folded her unfinished letter and placed it in the canvas tool roll. Outside, snow entered the walnut lane without wind. The restored chimney released a thin grey thread above the roof, and the windows held 8 steady squares of amber light. The cast iron stove Foundry waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Kell kept Clara's $5 bill in the back of her desk drawer rather than sending it to the treasurer. She had exchanged it with her own money on the morning of the sale. The bill remained beneath Elias's scorched note, folded once through the centre, waiting for the day Clara might need proof that $5 had once been enough to open a door.